Hello and a good evening, everybody. Today I'm speaking again to Dr. Richard Sakwa on the Russian-Ukraine war, and in particular because Ukraine has sort of faded from the news headlines given the crisis in the Middle East. Dr. Sakwa, welcome back to this channel.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Um, I'll ask you this: where are we with the Russian-Ukraine war? Last time we spoke once about the origin of this conflict, which was, argument NATO expansion, the post-World Order, post-World War II order sort of coming apart, things of that nature. Then obviously the war started. Lots of people got killed, things of that sort, and now it does seem that there's some kind of ceasefire. Is that correct? Coming to the closing. So is there diplomacy happening?
Well, there's no ceasefire. There's talk of it, of course.
Mm.
What has happened is that the big issue of this summer was the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which clearly has not met any of its goals, and instead of which it's now described as a stalemate. Though I'm not sure that's the right word. I'll come back to that. But clearly, over the last month, since it began on the 4th of June, Russia has captured more territory than Ukraine. Both sides have suffered enormous losses, but it seems that Ukrainians more, and of course Russia's bigger, so that it could go longer. So there's a lot of talk of the war becoming one of attrition, very much a First World War type event, which is catastrophic. It's obviously enormously sad for all concerned, and above all, Ukrainians. They're people now. They're running out of people, so they're now taking very young boys. They're taking older men, and of course, increasingly women. And so, which is absolutely awful. So that's where we are. And of course, the other big event is the dissent within the Ukrainian government, and we've seen the major article by President Zelensky about him by Simon Schuster in Time magazine, which depicts him as a rather lonely messianic figure, convinced constantly that they're going to achieve their maximalist aims, that is, the return of Crimea and returning Ukraine to 1991 borders. And of course, we've also had the interview with General Zaluzhny, head of the armed forces, who has quite clearly marked out the sense that the military affairs are at the moment not going anywhere, and hence the demand for more weapons, bigger weapons, faster delivery, and all of that. And of course, the Russians are mounting their smaller offensives, which is quite important. Avdiivka is important because it's from there that the Ukrainian forces were shelling Donetsk, and so the battle there is reminiscent of the one for Bakhmut earlier. So that's where we are on the front, and of course Russia's pushing towards moving Kupiansk. It's not both; these are all important, but they're not the big offensives, and I doubt that they'll take place in before they, because Russia's got a presidential elections next March, so they need just to keep the pressure up. But I have a feeling Russia feels that time is on its side.
And you touched a little bit on the stability of the Ukrainian government. Maybe elaborate a bit more on this, because in the past, when these type of conflicts have taken place, often coup d'états can follow very shortly after, things of that sort, internal dissent within the security forces in particular. You see in some countries, or just an election oust the president, political change. I mean, is there any possibility of this happening in Ukraine?
As for the election, there's been some debate about this. It's due next March at the latest, when President Zelensky's term comes to an end. And of course, the Ukraine is under state of emergency, which precludes elections, so it's unlikely to be held. But the United States was pushing for it because one interpretation is that they wanted to get rid of Zelensky through a legal mechanism. And of course, there's much talk of dissatisfaction with Zelensky's leadership because of his the messianic quality, which I mentioned earlier, insisting on a battle in Bakhmut when the United States and the British allegedly, well, appears were insisting that he should focus all their forces on pushing down to Melitopol and splitting, moving towards Crimea and splitting the land corridor. So indeed, there is much talk. Zaluzhny has been targeted as a potential leader of it, and of course, some of his subordinates have been sacked. And of course, there's disarray in earlier, towards the beginning of the autumn, the sacking of all the heads of the recruitment commissions, which has made it even more difficult to get personnel to the fronts. And so there does seem to be a sort of, and of course, the economic situation is getting worse. So it's very hard to see how this could play out beneficially for Ukraine, even though the West seems to be doubling down on its support. But as you mentioned, it's being distracted, I mean, in an appalling way, to events in Southwest Asia.
Yeah, it's quite frightening what's happening over there. So I mean, this government doesn't seem, to see, and the talks of peace between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky, he made a statement, if I remember, something like we had a stalemate or something, which seemed to me to have signaled that they are prepared for negotiations. I mean, is this going to amount to anything in your view, or are we still, sort of at this quagmire?
No, I don't think it's going to get anywhere under the present leadership on all sides. I mean, Western leadership with Biden, and of course, there's a U.S. presidential election next year. So who knows what might happen if Trump, who seems the likely candidate to oppose him next November, in fact, just over a year away now. And of course, within Ukraine, a possible change of leadership. We've just mentioned that. In Russia, I think that almost certainly it's a nail-biting finish, of course, whether Putin will get re-elected for a fifth term, but I think he'll just about manage it. So we can assume that leadership continues. Two things, of course, in addition. On the one side is you have the Ukrainian constitution, which is now basically precluding by law negotiations with Russia. So, and of course, Zelensky is insisting there can be no discussion. And of course, on the Russian side, a lot of commentators and politicians arguing that there can be no negotiations with the present Ukrainian leadership. There's another analogy which is sort of lurking in the background, and for those who've studied the history of Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, will recall that in 1963, Diem was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup, in fact killed, and what they hoped to be a more pliable South Vietnamese leadership under Thieu would emerge, which it did under Thieu, and there's some talk of that, which I think is probably far-fetched, but not totally excluded, something like that, because the United States is also facing shortages of supplies. And of course, the latest tranches have been much smaller than earlier. So the tide of, not only of battle, but of support, Western support, is beginning, I won't say exhausted, but beginning to become, the word has been fatigue.
But in terms of Western support, when this war started, there was a bit of a drift, well, a small drift, between the European leaders and the Americans very early on. Even Macron at one stage was sort of saying we're going to respect the Minsk II protocol. And then later on, he just fell in line like the rest of them, Scholz and the rest. Has there been any, in your view, any sign of the Europeans rising to the occasion and saying, look, this is our continent and we will try and sort out this problem with Russia?
I very much appreciate you asking that question, because it's one which particularly close to my heart. Because as in my recent journeys, for example, I came across, met once again my friend, well, not a personal friend, but my acquaintance, Pierre de Gaulle, who is the grandson of Charles de Gaulle, and he has established a Fondation Pierre de Gaulle, which is continuing that idea of some sort of pan-continental European unity, as opposed to the dominance of Atlanticism, which has predominated since 1945. And it's obviously something which I've been arguing for, that Europe should take control of its own destiny, its own security, obviously with the United States, not against it, but separate from the United States, as opposed to being what some people argue vassals. And of course, the argument has long been made that as far as Europe is concerned, it's a question of European security. For the United States, it's a question of alliance management and alliance strategy, which is a very different thing entirely. As for the substance of your question, in my view, catastrophically, no. There is absolutely no sign. Obviously, Macron says a lot of things, but of course, you catch him in the morning, he says one thing, in the afternoon, something different. And to paraphrase uh, Marx and Engels in the German ideology, in the evening, yet a third thing. And of course, no follow through. And of course, the French have certain interests, but he's doubled down even more. The German government has doubled down and is taking an increasing burden of the um, bulk of the financial burden and the military supply burden. And of course, if you listen to the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, I heard an interview with her just a few days ago. And to be honest, I was shocked. I mean, not surprised, but shocked in the unpleasant sense. And it's important to maintain a sense of surprise and shock, even though this sort of language has become normalized, which I think is appalling. Well, her language was dogmatic aggression. Dogmatic to the point at which, no, excluding any idea of talking, and that Ukraine can even a chink of light for diplomacy. And of course, that's the line of Ursula von der Leyen at the head of the Commission and her appalling team at the head of the European Union. All of them have got, we expected the European Union to take the lead in trying to find some sort of diplomatic solution. It has done the opposite. It has been a cheerleader for geopolitical confrontation, great power conflict, and a continuation of the war. I don't know whether the European Union's reputation will survive. I hope that it'll survive as an economic union, but as a geopolitical actor, it has discredited itself. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen, without the permission of her colleagues, went to Palestine, went to Israel to indicate absolute, complete, and unquestionable support for Israel. Of course, we all share her sentiment of the appalling condemnation of the attack on the 7th of October. But again, the response has to be proportionate and, of course, has to obey humanitarian international law.
Yeah, I totally agree there. And I mean, the other block I want to talk on before we get to Russians is the this what is now called the global south, although it's that term has been criticized so heavily, but the called former non-aligned country, or the non-Western countries, if you will. The African Union at one stage had a delegation sent to Russia where Ramaphosa from South Africa was there, and I thought, I criticized Ramaphosa a lot locally, but he did quite a good job to make the argument that leaders should talk and peace and diplomacy. Is the influence of the global south still not as significant on the global stage to actually sway any of this sort? I mean, what do you make of that story?
No, I actually think that we ought to defend the term global south. As you say, it's been attacked. I mean, Russians and others now talk of a global majority, and which is a perhaps more loaded term. But no, I think the global south is a great term. And of course, precisely because of its power, it is being critiqued, because what it does show is that the global north has made a dog's dinner mess of its post-Cold War security, whereas the global south, we're talking about there, including all the way from China, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, Asia more broadly. All these countries, it is effectively the global south, whereas the north is this Atlantic system and the Eurasian powers, which are now locked in conflict with Russia. So the global south, I think that the term is good. And second, what has happened is that in the post-war years after 1945, these countries were mainly concerned with decolonization, with basic development, state building, nation building, and the system has matured. The Russo-Ukrainian wars forced it to mature even faster. And of course, events in Palestine, Israel conflict has even more forced it to the forefront, because quite honestly, the global north has discredited itself. So there's a huge diplomatic opportunity. And I must say that it's South Africa, delighted to take in the lead. Also, of course, Brazil under Lula da Silva has taken a major part. We just had a BRICS meeting online at G20 meetings and so on. These certainly the BRICS is fundamentally important. As I say, it's the maturing of the post-colonial state system, and now the voice of the global South has to be heard. It has to be heard, and it's a voice calling for peace, for development, and a new type of politics which isn't obsessed with the dominance of the United States or the emergence of China or Russia status concerns. We have to move beyond this politics and to really say there is an alternative. It can be different. We don't have to be obsessed by these endless conflicts. And of course, in Southwest Asia, uh, we had a quartet, and the United States refused to allow it to work. And in part, that's clearly one of the factors which has led to the deepening of the crisis, which has exploded in such a catastrophic and awful way now.
How do you explain the ignorance of what I call the Western world? I mean, Europe, you
Mm,
say, sort of a vassal of America, particularly the United States. The ignorance of their, I would argue, diminishing influence in the world. But then the second point is more the ignorance that they are hypocrites. I can't put it another way. I mean, if you compare the pretext for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, um, you can make the argument it was the same pretext for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Actually, there was
mm,
some validity to Russia's pretext. So, not that I justify the pretext, but the U.S. invasion of Iraq was just unprovoked aggression. And yet, the United States' leadership or elites cannot come to bring this obvious mirror to themselves.
yeah. The way I explain that, and I think it's a fundamental point, is that since the Second World War, we've had this emergence of a political West, which is again another term like the global South, much contested. Russia likes to use the term collective West. Others have used the term historical West. I think that confuses the different sorts of Wests because I'm a Westerner. I defend its achievements, its many of its qualities, which are very important. But what I don't like is the emergence after 1945 of a US-led militarized political West and an ideological political military formation, which today is and after 1989, the end of the Soviet Union, has become lost a sense of proportion and a sense of its place in the world. In a sense, it's a more modest place in the world rather than its endless striving for US-led dominance. So, and this political West, its double standards to which you allude, is a systemic quality of it. It's not accidental today that it's responded to the appalling killings in Gaza, which are just quite outrageous, and there's no question about it. Obviously, Israel, you could say, has a right to defend itself, but it has to do it within the bounds of international humanitarian law. But at the same time, the response, as you say, is so disproportionate. We've seen a recent figure, a very tragic one, that as of now, a United Nations figure, some 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have died in the war so far. 10,000, too many in my view, but 10,000. Just in the last 5-6 weeks, we've seen over 11,000 civilians, over nearly 5,000 of them children, many the others mainly women, have been killed in Gaza. And yet the response is so, as you say, so different to these both are human tragedies of an epic scale. And so, just as you say, there's double standards involved in it. Another point you make is the one about the vassalization of the European states. Absolutely right. What we see in this war, the Russia-Ukrainian war and the Palestine issue, is the marginalization of the European Union and European, what I call legacy states. That's the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but the first three main ones, Germany and France. These are legacy great powers. They have been in, like Japan, by the way, the other side of the world. These are legacy great powers with still huge diplomatic, how can I put it, history and soft or elements of weight in the world. They have not exercised it responsibly. And so they've become further marginalized. This is now openly discussed in China, in India, elsewhere. openly that these wars are the final wars, the final nail in the coffin of Europe as a responsible actor in international affairs. None of them, even when they've wanted to do it, have been able to act and to provide diplomatic initiatives because decisions are made in Washington, they're made in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, they're made in Beijing, they're made in New Delhi, they're made in Johannesburg, by the way, or Brasilia. They're not made in Brussels anymore.
Well, I want to elaborate on that point, and the danger of that is this. The way I see it from a perspective of somebody who grew up in the developing world. In South Africa, as an example, and it's probably true of Brazil as well, we have leftover communities from empire, if you will. We are
Mm.
still a minority there. And now, with the hypocrisy from the Western world coming, they are forcing our governments into a very difficult situation because we are post colonial societies of complex identities. And if we are forced to choose one power over the other, which is what these countries want sometimes, we are going to create internal conflict in our own
Mm.
societies. Okay. And I've not seen this point being mentioned, but it's enormous risk. I mean, we're seeing it now with the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're seeing it with the Russian-Ukraine conflict. It totally did South Africa on racial lines. And I actually give our government credit for not
Mm.
taking a too strong stance, although they are still being criticized by those communities. They say we shall leftovers. So it's as if they're being radicalized by the same ideology. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Mm. Yes. When you say, I mean, clearly there's a whole debate about post-coloniality. And the great achievement of South Africa and Brazil and many other countries is that, yes, they are post-colonial societies, hybrid, as you say, with leftover communities, or I wouldn't use that term, but communities which are, these are complex societies, and all credit to, I mean, there's enormous problems in South Africa, of course, and Brazil, and perhaps less sharp at this moment, but certainly there are. But these societies have been, genuinely post-colonial. And the thing about post-coloniality is that it's hybrid, that by definition, my argument has always been that this should be welcomed, that this should be embraced, that, obviously South Africa has got a boa, if I can use that term, I'm not sure it's allowed, but a community, sense and identity in it. That's it's important. It's part of that development. Any group which tries then to claim an exclusivity will lead to conflict. Exactly what you said, and this is part of the reason for the war in Ukraine today. That a particular community, and what has, one can say, the maturity and intelligence of the elite, and I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela and those who follow that line. How, again, all the big mistakes have been made, of course, but it's, that line is important. Unfortunately, Ukraine did not have a leader of that stature after the end of it, and instead of which they've taken a different line. And the word to describe it is decoloniality. Now, decoloniality is very different from post-coloniality, which accepts hybridity, accepts the difficulties, but tries to work through them. And multiple communities, multiple languages, multiple civilizational identities, multiple histories. This is, as I say, a source of, to be engaged with and to be celebrated. And a rainbow nation is a fantastic term. Whereas the Ukrainian side decided that it was decoloniality, tries to excavate from under the debris of alleged colonialism some sort of essence of the nation underneath it, which of course means trying to repudiate that, in the Soviet Union, we had 74 years of that. We also had the Tsarist time, several centuries of interaction between the great Ukrainian nation and people, and the Russian people as well. And of course, this is a similar situation in Estonia and in Latvia, and indeed
Yeah.
Lithuania in a different way, which is tragic. I've just had to come across Lithuanians who, who describe how they had to swim across a river to escape repression in Lithuania, in the European Union today, the last year, 2022. And so many stories I hear of this repression in the Baltic states, which of course has assumed a type of similar state building to Ukraine. So, and of course, all of this is amplified by that political West, by Brussels, by Washington, who do not have, I just can't understand it, why they're not talking about peace and reconciliation uh,
Yeah.
based on a post colonial, instead of which they've adopted this decoloniality, which is a sort of an essentialist, primordialist, aggressive. And of course, it suits the geopolitical purposes of both Brussels and
Well,
Washington.
I mean, to expand on that, so this is what I would regard as the biggest challenge for post-colonial societies. And look, South Africa is not immune from this conflict. We've tried to manage it. I argue
Mm,
Namibia is the country to look to manage it. They're far better than we are. But be that as it may, or Botswana, one of these countries that nobody knows about sometimes. But if you go to Eastern Europe, to South Africa, to Brazil, to many of these countries, you find this internal conflict within the societies. And there's total ignorance. And I get your view on this, but my sense is that the Israeli-Palestine conflict falls on the same line. There's an inability, there's an extreme case of it again. There's an inability of two populations, one obviously more dominant than the other, to just coexist with one another and understand that they are an outcome of a complex history.
yeah, absolutely. It's very complex, and at the same time, of course, it's absolutely polarized, and at the moment, deeply embittered. And anything one says on the issue is liable, as you've probably, as you well know, leads to embitterment. You're absolutely right that these two communities, we're talking about Palestinians, we're talking about Israelis. I mean, we're talking about the Jewish part of the Israeli state. Uh, yeah, this is why I do fault the political West for the last 20 or 30 years. It's had attempts to resolve it. Oslo may have been a way forwards, the two-state solution. I've always been in favor for a long time, and of course, this was an idea right from the beginning of a. It's very difficult to envisage a two-state solution. It's almost like a fantasy world now. People mention the two-state solution just it to stop them thinking, to stop anything serious happening. The only way forwards is a one-state solution, in which these communities can flourish as nations, as peoples, as cultures, as civilizations, but economically integrated, and of course, all within the bounds of a liberal constitution, in which the dignity and humanity of all those who live there, the Jewish people, the Christians, the obviously the Arab Muslims, all live. And all based on a vision of development, of economic development. And of course, Jordan has a role to play in that, Saudi Arabia and all Egypt, the neighbors, Lebanon, have a role to play in all of that. And instead of geopolitical outsiders exploiting the divisions and conflicts to try to ensure their so-called primacy, hegemony, of course, this is totally at this moment in time almost absurdly utopian. But if we don't have a vision of where we could possibly go, because there's after the conflict, the dreadful conflict ends in Gaza, there will be a post Gaza conflict situation to be dealt with. And I hope it doesn't lead to a second Nakba, second expulsion, and a second, decades of exploitation, of suffering, because the Gazan people have a right to live in dignity with
Yeah.
development and safety as any other people. And I insist on that.
No, I totally agree. I would argue, to close on this one, is the outcome there I would like to see is something on the lines of a one state that can still
Mm,
guarantee itself its homeland for the Jewish people. I have no objection to that.
absolutely.
Something on
Yeah.
those lines. I mean, I'm not preaching to people what their solution would be, but I don't see, like you, how you can, sort of a phrase that the F.W. de Klerk used in South Africa, you could unscramble the omelet.
Yeah.
Populations have mixed already. It's a fact.
Mm.
Just to get the question on Russia here, because we talk about this response. What is the attitude inside Russia at the moment, and is there a difference between what the Russian leaders and the population are saying?
No, it's actually intensifying the Russian. But the way that NATO has fought this proxy war, and of course made life so difficult for ordinary Russian citizens, I mean, I'm still shocked by the fact that the political West has blocked flights from Russia and transport links and closing borders and confiscating Russian registered cars if they go to Germany. It's only happened once to my knowledge, but still, it's once too many. It's this is an attack against the Russian people, and it is perceived as such. And so, obviously, we're seeing Putin's support up in the 80% level. It's higher than it was at the beginning of the war. And I visit Russia. I believe in keeping channels of communication open. I believe in dialogue, and that's why I would go. Even at the height of the Soviet Union, people traveled to the Soviet Union to talk to people. Now, I won't say I'm engaged in citizen diplomacy because I'm just an individual. Yet I do think, the fact that I'm talking to these people, including certain officials and academics whom I've known for many, many years, it's quite clear that you know, a recent opinion poll showed that the majority of Russians want peace. Absolutely, they don't like this war, despite endless government propaganda. But there's still within that a sense of grim determination to see this through to the end. Incidentally, that's exactly the view of opinion polls suggest surveys within Ukraine as well. That the belief that there can be any compromise is also so excluded. So on both sides, we have a deeply entrenched positions and very strong commitment to see this conflict both seen in existential terms for the survival of their states, survival of their civilizations. So it's very, and of course, the this is on the Ukrainian side supported by the political West, because the modern Ukrainian state is a project of the political West. This isn't to deny them agency, but it is but it isn't to deny Ukrainian government agency, but at the same time, there were many other different possibilities within Ukraine which were not given agency and not respected by the political West. It was denigrated. We're talking
Oh.
about not just the Russophone community, because many Russophones support the Kiev government, and quite understandably so. But there were also different, even across the spectrum within Ukraine, a peace idea of a multicultural, multilingual, multinational society, and that vision of Ukraine was has at the moment died. Hopefully, some sort of it
Mm.
can be restored in one way or another.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Do you think it's still possible to revive, any remnant of that? Because as far as I know, the Russian language is pretty much banned in Ukraine. Not something of that
Right.
nature.
The Russian language, Russian
Well,
Orthodox Church, Moscow
or the
Patriarch.
Orthodox as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's a cultural Kulturkampf being taking place within the Kiev-controlled parts of Ukraine. On the other hand, of course, we have parts of the four regions, plus, of course, Crimea. Yeah, whether at the moment, of course, the positions and the hostility will take a long time to overcome. On the other hand, the only way to solve and to stop the war, Russia-Ukrainian war, is, of course, first a European envelope, and of course, then a global envelope. It has to be one in which the United States and the political West decides, look, we need to make a deal. At that stage, then we'll mobilize constituencies within Ukraine to make a deal with Moscow. What Putin said at the Valdai meeting, that it wasn't a question of territory, it was a question of security. That leaves the door open for some sort of territorial arrangement.
But
So,
is there now at least? I mean, there surely should be among the U.S. establishment an appreciation that Russia had, I wouldn't say legitimate security concerns or perception of legitimate security concerns. I mean, is that message not finally going to sink into our own leadership and say what we've done here was totally nuts, for lack of a better
yes.
word?
Well, that's my view. I've always said that this war was provoked by an intensifying security dilemma, and that Russia wasn't making it up. Quite clearly, for example, last September, 2022, sorry, September, yeah, 20, September 2021, before the war, and that autumn, the United States was signing a high-level security partnership with Ukraine. I mean, and of course, this would commit them to arms, commit ultimately, possibly to US bases. Who knows where this would have led? This was September, then finally an agreement in November that year. December, Russia puts forward its security treaties. They were maximalist. People dismiss it, as you say, But that was the beginning for negotiation. NATO basically dismissed it immediately. The United States kept the door open to diplomacy, but it was only a tiny bit ajar, and it really didn't deal with any substantive issue. You're quite right. Russian security concerns were neglected, and not only that, denigrated as actually fundamentally illegitimate for the 2 or 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. It's quite an astonishing when the history books are written, the way that Clinton and his colleagues, and of course others who just basically said, initially Moscow's too weak, they may complain, but we're going to push it down. When Russia became stronger, then they try to delegitimate the Russian leadership as fundamentally illegitimate. And as for your fundamental question, is is there some sort of emerging understanding in the political West? Macron, of course, has been the one we did believe. I mean, he said himself that European security cannot be built against Russia; it has to be built with it. It seems to be politics 101
Well,
postulate.
across France, that is understood and it's openly discussed in the media at the moment. I mean, it's been since the war started. Not that I don't think what the French say mattered because they either suggested the opposite. But Dominique de Villepin, for example, who
Yeah.
was, stood up against Bush at the Iraq War, was on TV on numerous occasions here in France saying the exact same thing, saying this is about NATO expansion. Unless you speak to Russia's concerns, security concerns, and we start diplomacy and things of that nature, all things that you and I, others have been saying, we're going to continue the war. So there seems, at least in Europe, an understanding among it, but they don't act on it. I mean, it's crazy.
Could we add Hubert Vedrin to that as well? I think I said these things. In Germany, there's a surprising lack of people saying that, and of course, we've seen the split in Die Linke, and Sarah Wagenknecht has emerged in her movement, which is also understanding. Like this, we have Viktor Orban. We have now the election of Robert Fico in Slovakia. And of course, now the recent election in the Netherlands, which is interesting. So we're beginning to see some. I don't know what his foreign policy positions are on this issue, but clearly it's a cause for alarm in the political West.
Okay. Well, I mean, yeah, it's. I hope it continues on that thing. Just sort of on the last few points, you touch on Russia as well. To ask the same questions: Are the Russians, coming to an understanding that they should also move to a path to diplomacy? Because,
Mm.
I mean, the Russians are clearly being isolated. It can't be or isolated, at least from the West.
Yeah.
I mean, it clearly also can't be good for their economy and their society.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, isolation is relative because they've actually reforged strong links with across the so-called global south and with China, and certainly far from isolated. So what we're now seeing is a split, a catastrophic, tragic split within Europe. The United States will go on; it's doing well. Its exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe has increased sixfold. What's not to like? It's doing well economically. Its geopolitical position has restored itself at the center, and this endless so-called unity of Europe and the United States in this war. What does this mean? It just means that those alliance relationships have been forged ever stronger with a vassalized Europe and a failure uh, to have these two legs of the Atlantic alliance system walking on an equal basis. Yeah, what's not to like as far as they're concerned? Of course, the fact it's led to the devastation of Ukraine, but Ukraine seemed to have been willing to take the burden, considering this a civilization war. Is Russia ready for peace? Obviously, Putin, his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, always say they're open to negotiations, but at the moment, for negotiations to go anywhere, there has to be a modicum of trust. No side, and certainly Moscow does not trust anything which any Western leader says today because they've reneged on everything. Of course, the Minsk agreement still stands as a testimony to what was felt. It was tough. Okay, the Ukrainians didn't want it. Okay, you don't like the Minsk agreement. Let's talk about something else then. But instead of which, they pretended to support it, continued the sanctions renewal every 6 months on the basis of Russia's failure to implement Minsk, when all the time as they now openly say, it was a chance to arm Ukraine and to keep punishing Russia. So we're in a very, very deep pit. in which it's going to be very hard to climb out of from all sides.
But I mean, what assurances would let me ask, what would reassure Russia that the US is actually sincere about negotiations? I mean, I would assume something like putting pressure on the Ukrainian government to make a move or anything of
Yes.
that nature.
That would be the first act, maybe a change of leadership, as we talked about at the beginning. But it'll be very hard because even if Trump is elected next year, as he boasted, he imposed more sanctions on Russia than anyone else. It was Obama who refused to send offensive missiles, and it was Trump who started sending Stingers and other, offensive weapons to Ukraine. So but of course, a second Trump presidency will be very different from the first. He won't have the Russiagate allegations hanging over his shoulder, and he'll be in a more militant mood, which could tear US society apart. But there's almost nothing, which will make Russia trust any Western leader for this generation and possibly the next, because the West, as far as they can see, reneged on the commitments to Gorbachev about NATO enlargement, and ever since then simply negated the fact, I don't believe in spheres of influence in the old-fashioned sense, but I do believe in spheres of security. And clearly, some sort of neutrality for Ukraine is essential. But then, of course, what guarantee is that any cessation of conflict today isn't just a preparation for the renewal of conflict later? So we need a really big, holistic peace deal. And I actually think that let's go back to the global south has a part to play in this. China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, African leaders, other African leaders, Egypt I have in mind in particular, but others as well have a part to play in all of this. Because in other words, I'm beginning to get the feeling that Europe is so deep in its conflict and in its renewal constantly of hatred. We see this in the Eastern European states, Poland and the Baltic states, so consumed by its retributive sense of retribution for Tsarist sins and Soviet sins, which were undoubtedly, the Soviet ones, undoubtedly great, but so consumed by them that only some solution from outside of Europe can deal with European conflicts, which is a tragic statement about the dead end and the impasse and the exhaustion and bankruptcy of our present generation of leaders.
Yeah, I suppose the missing word, sort of the last question is the question of reconciliation with a complex history.
Mm.
Missing phrase. I mean, I don't know what you think of that, but is that I mean that should have occurred after the post-war, of the Cold War, right, to prevent these things, and that never
Yeah.
occurred. Yeah.
I've always said that the Copenhagen criteria for membership of the European Union talks about economic and political and democratic achievement, absorption capacity, but the fourth Copenhagen criteria should precisely have been reconciliation. Instead of which, the European Parliament, in adopting resolutions which compare, can you believe it? Compare Nazism and Soviet communism, both dreadful in their own ways, but very different, very different. And the idea that a country like the Soviet Russia, which lost 27 million people in fighting Nazi Germany, should be equated into the same way. A million died in the liberation of Poland from Nazi Germany. So these are different types of things, and the simple, political equation is again a sign of intellectual exhaustion and intellectual. How can I put it?
But I mean, Europe achieved this in a sense with Nazism, not entirely. But if you take it de Gaulle and Adenauer, for example,
Yes.
they talked, and these were countries that almost eliminated each other in 3 wars within 100 years, something of that sort. And they managed to successfully work out their problems. So if the Western Europeans could do that on that issue, I mean, it's just beyond belief that they couldn't do it with the eastern side of it.
On the other hand, of course, they did it in the context of the First Cold War against the Soviet Union, which, of course, brought many Nazis back into government, and, of course, whitewashing many. And only in the 60s did they come back to the denazification agenda. But you're absolutely right that the European unity, it doesn't have to be European Union, was precisely designed to prevent France and Germany to go to war again. uh, against each other again, as you say, 3 times in a century. The big challenge after 1989 and the end of the first Cold War was to ensure that Moscow is brought back, and of course, with it, we're talking about Kiev and we're talking about the Central Asian states. All of them are brought back into a comfortable European political community, and that is on the agenda today. I actually really strongly believe that we cannot achieve this now with the United States as part of it, or the United Kingdom, by the way, which is committed and has been for 70 years to prevent pan-European unity in favor of Atlantic unity. But Europeans have to do it themselves. A new generation of leaders, so we've mentioned these new leaders within Europe, and of course some of those politicians in France, gradually I think that the agenda will turn, and we then have to recreate a vision of a united European continent, walking with the United States, but not completely part of a single community with it.
All right. Well, Dr. Richard Sakwa, we're going to leave it there. But thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.